Hi, I'm Roy Schwartz. I write about pop culture for The Forward and for CNN.com, and I am the author of Is Superman Circumcised? The Complete Jewish History of the World's Greatest Hero. Comic books are a Jewish invention. Superheroes are a Jewish invention. They started in the Depression when an out-of-work school teacher from the Bronx named Maxwell Ginsberg, came up with the idea of licensing old newspaper comic strips and Sunday funnies and reprinting them in magazine format. This is the first comic book you see here. It's Famous Funnies #1, July 1934. And they're named comics, by the way, because originally they were all humorous material. This is the first superhero, Superman. He debuted in Action Comics #1, cover dated June 1938. He was created by two Jewish teenagers from Cleveland, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. The first episode of Secret Identities was about him. You can find it on the CSP website, along with a lot of other cool stuff. The comic book industry in its early days was almost exclusively populated by Jews, since more respectable businesses, creative industries like book publishing, magazines, ad agencies were mostly closed to them. It was an industry of kith and kin. One publisher was Martin Goodman, born Mo Goodman, from Brooklyn, the oldest of 17 children of Jewish immigrants from Lithuania, who in his teens during the Depression was reportedly a traveling hobo. He got into publishing at the age of 21, and by 24 was the co-owner and editor of Newsstand Publications, which published pulp magazines. One of which you see here, was named Marvel Science Stories. Following the success of Superman and Batman, they started a comic book imprint, naming it Timely Comics, and their first comic book, published October 1939, Marvel Comics. They printed 80,000 copies and quickly sold out. A second printing sold out of 800,000 copies. And so Marvel Comics was born. Timely's first staffer was a Jewish 26-year-old named Jaime Simon, is editor, writer, and artist. Their second was a Jewish 22-year-old artist named Jacob Kurtzberg. We'll talk plenty more about Kirby in upcoming episodes. Among many other things, in 1940 they created Captain America together, which was a big hit. In 1939, they hired a cousin of Goodman's wife as an office assistant, a Jewish 17-year-old by the name of Stanley Lieber. When Lieber started getting writing assignments, he adopted the pen name Stanley. In late 1941, Simon and Kirby left Timely following a dispute with Goodman, and with little choice, Goodman made Lee, at the stately age of 19, the temporary editor-in-chief. It lasted 31 years, and in 1972, Lee succeeded Goodman as publisher. In the 50s, superhero comics fell out of favor, and other genres became popular, like horror, western, romance, giant monsters. This giant monster is the first appearance of Groot, if you know him from Guardians of the Galaxy. Timely, which was now generally known as Atlas Comics, but not consistently, did not have the same success. Goodman ended up firing the entire staff except for Lee, who now oversaw an army of freelancers. By 1960, Lee wanted out. He was dissatisfied with his job. As he tells it, he found the comics they were publishing juvenile and banal. He was planning to leave and change careers when Goodman asked him to try superheroes again. Lee's wife, Joan, suggested that since he had nothing to lose, he should try writing them the way he always wanted to. So he reached out to Jack Kirby, whom he considered the best artist in the business, rightly, in my opinion. And in November 1961, they introduced the Fantastic Four. Then in 1962, the Hulk, Thor, Ant-Man. In 1963, Iron Man, the Avengers, the X-Men. In 66, Silver Surfer, Black Panther, etc., etc., and hundreds of other heroes, villains, cast, concepts. It was a remarkable streak of creativity. I talk more about this in the Jewish Origins of the Marvel Universe program, which is also on the CSB website. Lee also created Spider-Man in 62 and Doctor Strange in 63 with Steve Ditko, and Daredevil in 64 with Bill Everett, neither Jewish. And we'll get back to Spidey in a moment. More than just new characters, Lee and these artists created a whole new approach to the genre, introducing greater realism and deeper characterization. The company was now known as Marvel Comics, and this innovation came to be known as the Marvel Revolution. Lee earned the nickname Stan the Man, and Kirby King of Comics. Those are nicknames they gave themselves, but they stuck. They may not be widely thought of as such, but their output and its impact on modern culture makes Lee one of the most influential writers of the 20th century, and Kirby one of its most influential artists. There was another revolution that coincided with Marvel. And I don't mean the youth revolution or the rock and roll revolution, though these were certainly influences. What I mean is the Jewish revolution. Jews have always had a significant presence in American entertainment, from Hollywood to Broadway to stand-up comedy to comics. But in the late 50s and through the 60s, Jews stepped from the background to the foreground. And yes, everyone you see here is Jewish, including Marilyn, who converted in 56 and stayed Jewish till her death. And it wasn't just the prominence of Jews who were out and largely kept their Jewish names, they also brought Jewish culture with them to varying degrees. Comics were more careful about that for a bunch of reasons. The target audience was still mainly kids in middle America, and the industry took a beating in the 50s, a topic for another time. The first openly Jewish superhero, Seraph, wouldn't show up until 1977. But what was always there in metaphor, like you see here, started to gradually become more obvious. For example, in Fantastic Four, the first modern Marvel comic and the one that ignited the revolution, Lee and Kirby introduced the Thing, who was never explicitly but was very clearly Jewish. More than that, he was very clearly Jack Kirby. The Thing's real name is Benjamin Jacob Grimm, after Jack and his father, and he is a gruff, cigar-chomping, thick-browed brawler from the Lower East Side, just like Kirby. Marvel eventually did make him canonically Jewish in 2002, and since then he's had all kinds of Jewish expressions in the comics. Which brings us to Spider-Man. The worst kept secret in comics is that Spider-Man, Marvel's flagship character, is Jewish. Now, it's not official and probably never will be, but the themes and hints have been there from the beginning, and over the years have come to stop just short of explicit. Spider-Man is considered to be the character most likely to be Stan Lee's alter ego. Lee said that Spider-Man was his favorite creation because he's the one most like me. And it does seem like he put a lot of himself into Peter Parker. Spider-Man's other creator, Steve Ditko, was not Jewish, so in terms of parentage, at least, Spidey is half Jewish, though he was an acolyte of Ayn Rand, Elisa Zinovievna Rosenbaum, to the uninitiated. Ditko designed the costume, arguably the best superhero costume, and he gave Spidey his personality, his body language, the way he moves and crawls and swings. He also made him look like a real average teen, short and skinny and awkward, instead of a strapping heroic figure like most other superheroes. Spider-Man first appeared in Amazing Fantasy number 15, August 1962, which means that he just turned 60. Mazel tov. Spider-Man was groundbreaking in several ways. First and foremost, that he was a teen superhero instead of a teen sidekick. And he wasn't a fearless hero. He was a brainy neurotic, an anxious nebbish, even after he gained superpowers. Very much the Jewish stereotype, certainly then. He was in many ways an inversion of Superman, a hero who was in truth, not in pretense, a bashful, bespectacled intellectual. He didn't pretend to be Clark Kent, he was. He was a true underdog in and out of costume, representing the struggling everyman in a way that Superman hadn't since the 30s. Balancing the facets of his identity wasn't just challenging. He usually failed miserably, and his angst was much higher pitched than Clark Kent's ever was, which he dealt with by wisecracking constantly, Mad Magazine style. A sense of humor, by the way, that with a few exceptions has been oddly missing from all 8 Spider-Man films. So it's a bone I have to pick with him. As Lee himself said, Spider-Man is basically Woody Allen. He was also unpopular with the cool kids, like Flash Thompson and Liz Ellen here. This is something every kid can relate to, certainly kids who read comics before they became cool, but it stands out that he's a kid with brown hair, brown eyes, and a small frame being picked on relentlessly by a group of Aryan kids. More than that, he's not just made fun of or left out, he's singled out and bullied relentlessly, which in this context can be seen as persecution or prejudice. And it's not incidental. It's this inclusion and abuse that caused him to turn his back on society at first, to become insular. He has no interest in becoming a hero. He goes into show business to make money instead. When a robber he doesn't bother stopping later kills his Uncle Ben, who raised him, he learns the famous lesson that with great power comes great responsibility. Which by the way, is ironic, since it's anathema to the Randian philosophy Ditko subscribed to. It's a different topic. Even after he becomes a superhero, he's still mistrusted and demonized by the press, particularly by J. Jonah Jameson, publisher of the Daily Bugle, who's obsessed with exposing him as a subversive threat. He constantly blames him for the crimes of his villains. Again, the public hostility towards Spider-Man is excessive and unjustified. He can never do right in the eyes of the world. His enemies can always get the benefit of the doubt. Which as far as Jewish metaphors go, is very apt. Peter is also an orphan, like most superheroes, a mold created by Superman and Batman, raised by his aunt and uncle in Forest Hills, Queens, a heavily Jewish neighborhood then and now. This is where he lived, by the way, in the Tobey Maguire movies that was filmed on location. One more thing from the thematic perspective, Spider-Man's powers, scaling and swinging from things, would be practically useless outside New York City. Talk about Jewish metaphor. Now, to be clear, Spider-Man is not canonically Jewish. When his religious or ethnic background come up, he's generally presented as a loosely mainline Protestant. There's a bunch of Spider-Man Christmas stories and the comics and the cartoons like you see here. We see here Aunt May in the first Spider-Man film from 2002 kneeling beside her bed saying the Lord's Prayer. Peter's mother was born Mary Teresa Fitzpatrick, not exactly a strong Jewish name, and as you can see here, his parents had a Christian wedding. The picture with the Pope, by the way, is just some random guy who dressed up to meet him, which I thought was hilarious, so I included it. There were some in-text hints about Spider-Man's Jewishness over the years, but they were sporadic and circumstantial. Like here, he's talking about a kibbutzer. Until September 2000, when a writer named Brian Michael Bendis was hired to launch a new comic series, Ultimate Spider-Man. Bendis is a former Orthodox yeshiva student who got his start doing caricatures at bar and bat mitzvahs, and when he broke into comics, he brought his background with him. He ended up writing the character longer than anyone else, including even Lee, eventually becoming Marvel's premier writer, an executive producer on several of its television shows, and a core member of the Marvel Creative Committee, which oversaw the company's ventures in film and other media. So he became this kind of guide. His Spider-Man quipped like Seinfeld and constantly peppered Yiddishisms. To give you just a shtickle, a bissel, here's, what do we have? We have Oi, Mishigas, Fakakta, Oi, Shmendrik, Oi, Menashevitz, Oi, and there's a lot more. However, we can't assume he's meant to be Jewish for two reasons. One is that in this last issue, you see here in the bottom right, he says he's not Jewish. Second, and stay with me here, the Ultimate Spider-Man series isn't canon. It takes place in an alternate dimension designated Earth 1610, where he's still a teenager learning the ropes. The real Spider-Man lives in the mainstream canonical Marvel universe designated Earth 616. Bendis wrote that Spidey too, but with a lot less Yiddish. Still, he did include things like a reference to Shavuot, which is a very odd thing for a Gentile to mention. What's more, in several interviews and in his own blog, safely outside the comics, Bendis has stated repeatedly that Spider-Man is Jewish in any version. Either way, he opened the floodgates. In the past 20 years or so, following writers, usually Jewish but not always, have frequently incorporated Yiddish into Spidey's dialogue. He says so many ois, it's practically his catchphrase. Now, many of these Yiddishisms have really become New Yorkisms, even Americanisms, but there's still a critical mass here, right? I mean, look at this. We used to say in IDF military intelligence, once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, the third time is enemy action. There was also a recent digital comic that was only published online, in which Peter has amnesia, and upon realizing he has a good command of Yiddish, including full sentences, he assumes he's Jewish. The interesting thing is that the comic was very careful not to answer the question either way. There was another recent comic which also made some waves in the press because in it he fights a duo of sort of neo-Nazi supervillains, Baron Zemo and Wolf, and it's presumably heavily implied that he's Jewish. Wolf calls him a remarkable animal who's unclean from a lesser species and other such things. Zemo taunts him by telling him about his sword being made by Norse craftsmen with a handle forged from gold taken from the subhumans processed in the war, some grisly stuff. But it's tenuous. They don't know who he is under the mask, so to me it sounds more like general racist fulminations. The writer Joe Kelly isn't Jewish and he's never addressed this either way. Spider-Man's Jewish background outside the comics is also interesting. In December 1996, an over-leveraged Marvel declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It's a drama whose dramatis personae were Jewish, including Marvel's owner then, Tycoon Ron Perlman, that's the Revlon family, corporate raider Carl Icahn, and Savior stockholders Israeli-American duo Ike Perlmutter and Avi Arad. Together with Hollywood dealmaker David Maisel, also Jewish, dubbed Captain Finance in the press, Arad and Perlmutter were the architects of Marvel's transformation from licensor of products to producer of IP to producer of its own movies. Arad insisted to skeptical investors that Spider-Man alone was worth $1 billion. He was wrong. To date, Spider-Man movies have grossed over $8 billion, with annual retail sales of $1.3 billion. Spider-Man is the most profitable superhero ever, and it's not even close. The second place is Batman with roughly $500 million. People of Jewish background have played a prominent role in Spider-Man movies behind and in front of the camera. The Tobey Maguire trilogy was produced by Laura Ziskin and directed by Sam Raimi. Raimi grew up conservative. Amy Pascal is the former co-chair of Sony Pictures and the force behind the current collaboration between Sony and Marvel on the rights of the character. They sort of co-own them, which resulted in the current Tom Holland films. She was succeeded by Tom Rothman. Rodney Rothman, no relation to Tom, co-wrote and co-directed the animated movie Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. And Jake Johnson played Peter Parker in that movie. And Andrew Garfield, who played Spider-Man in 3 movies. Garfield, who's paternally Jewish, raised as Jewish, identifies as Jewish, said in several interviews that he considers Peter Parker to be Jewish. In his words, Peter is Jewish. It's a defining feature. There've also been some fun winks at Jewish audiences. In Spider-Man No Way Home, just came out last year, Spidey swings by a newsstand displaying an issue of The Forward in Yiddish, the Falvetz, with the headline, Ist das gut für Jiden? Is this good for the Jews? I thought it was hilarious. And in the PlayStation Spider-Man video game, there are some non-playable characters of Orthodox Jews which don't show up if the game is played on Shabbat. You can thank one of the game's senior programmers, Ellen or Ilan Ruskin, for this gem. Things get particularly interesting in 2018's Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, which, believe it or not, by the way, is the first ever animated superhero or action film made for theatrical release. They've never made it until then. The movie it features several versions of Spider-Man from alternate dimensions. That's a thing in the Spider-Man mythos, the different versions of himself. One is Peter B. Parker, who's introduced using his middle initial as if to distinguish him from the real Peter Parker. However, he's shown, as you see here, to come from Earth 616, the canonical Marvel Universe. And why is this important, you must be wondering. I'm glad you asked, I'll tell you. Because in a flashback, he can be seen for a split second stepping on the glass at his wedding. So, is Spider-Man Jewish? Lee was always coy about it. In a few times that he was asked pointedly, he changed the subject or just said he didn't know. But he never denied it. Danny Fingeroth, the guy next to him, was a senior editor at Marvel overseeing the Spider-Man titles for over a decade in the 90s. He never said Peter was Jewish in the comics, but he did later, many times, in interviews, talks, and books. He actually has a new book out, I put it in here, A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. It's a biography of Stan Lee and Marvel, which I highly recommend. Brian Michael Bendis, Avi Arad, Rodney Rothman, and Andrew Garfield all say he's Jewish. The comics seem to be of 2 minds about it. Then again, what's more Jewish than that? Thank you.